Okay, I'm with the Talon Metals team. Talon Metals is TLO on the TSX in Canada. They're also in the US on the OTC. I'm with Brian Goldner, the lead geo at Talon, and the CEO. His name is Henri Van Rooyen. How are you, gentlemen?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is an exciting conversation because I know that Talon doesn't do a lot of interviews, at least publicly, and you've had a lot of great news recently. So I want to delve into this news from holes 50 and hole 63 at the Tamarack project. But first, a little background for investors who are new to the company. Maybe you can tell us the Talon story and how you came to this point, Henri.
Yeah, thank you. So we got involved in the project back in 2014. The discovery was made by Rio Tinto, who also discovered the Eagle mine that's operating in Michigan. And then we did an earning or a farming in progressive stages, and we became the operator of the project late 2019, actually just before COVID. And we started operations in COVID back in the beginning of 2020. And that's when we decided we're going to become our own drilling operator, exploration company. We're going to bring in-house all of our geophysics. And it was actually an interesting time to do that because there wasn't much going on during COVID. And Brian elegantly found ways to compartmentalize people in different homes and whatnot. So I think we did actually maybe some of our amazing best work at the beginning of it was actually all during that COVID time period. But it also allowed us to bring everything in-house. While everybody else was standing down, we went for it. And we go back in the press releases, we announced a lot of good news. Didn't really do anything for us at that point from a market point of view. And we ended up announcing a deal for offtake with Tesla. I think it was kind of beginning of 2022. And the company did take off significantly post that on the basis of obviously us expanding the resources significantly with much more massive sulphides, and also on the back of, hey, we need this nickel to make batteries. And we shouldn't be completely reliant on China, although it wasn't as I say drastic as what things are today. I think it was a little bit more positive at that point in time when it comes to hey, we can get all the nickel we want out of maybe Indonesia, which is not the case anymore today. And then I think our valuation at that point was something like 9 million. And we actually shot up to 683 million sometime in 2022, which is it's like a rocket ship taking off. And then we began to, what they call this, the Lassonde Curve, I think invented by Dr. Lassonde, which is, hey, I have to get through feasibility. I need to get into construction. Most importantly, I have to start and execute well on the permitting process, which we're super excited about. And that's what we then commenced, and we filed our initial environmental assessment worksheet, which is a statement of, hey, this is what I think the project's going to look like. Please, like in Minnesota, please can we have comments from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the proximate tribal sovereign nations. And that's really what got us to this point today is those comments we then took, we processed each one of them. We asked one question is, what does it actually tell us? If somebody gives us a comment, we study each one of them to try and follow what is the concern? And the next question is, what do we do with that? Can we find a way to avoid and or mitigate? And that's what we've done for the last almost 18 to 24 months. And I think very successfully completely changed the way that we approach the project because we did get that real-time feedback from what's called the regulatory governmental unit. And we just in the process of getting that through the finalization stages, hopefully, so that we can begin the environmental review process, hopefully quite soon. So that's in a very long-winded way of saying that we entered into a contract, found what we believe is the world's last area for very, very high grade nickel. That's not been developed yet. But at the same time, we embrace the permitting process to the point that we look at that as an opportunity to make changes to the project to minimize the environmental input and just end up with a much better project as a consequence of listening.
Okay, very good. I do want to talk about the feasibility and permitting of the Tamarack project later in the conversation. But first, I want to talk about the first 6 months of 2025 and sort of what has transpired. Now, I have followed Talon since 2021. You were talking about the Tesla agreement in early 2022, the offtake agreement, the only mining company that's done a real offtake agreement with Tesla so far. And I remember those heydays. It was a fun time. And then, as you said, you went into the feasibility and permitting stage of the Lassonde Curve, and it did not work out favorably for the share price. So literally just in February and March, Talon's shares traded in Canada went as low as 7.5 cents, and it was mind-blowing for me to see this incredible project in the US, high grade, with nickel, with copper, with platinum, et cetera, trading at this valuation. It was really absurd. But as you mentioned, a lot of it had to do with the price of nickel. And it's just out of favor right now because of what's happening in Asia. We all know about China and the mining they're doing of the laterites, et cetera, et cetera. So it seemed like for a moment, the Talon story was in trouble back in February and March. Then all of a sudden, this news comes out at the end of March that you've made a new discovery. You've drilled a deeper hole to test an anomaly at depth, and voila, it's like 8 meters of incredibly rich, massive sulphides. And then you followed up on that. You drilled an even better hole. That's a total of almost 35 meters of massive sulphides. And all of a sudden, the story is alive again. So tell us, Brian, how did you make that new discovery in hole 50?
Yeah, it's a great story. We have been kind of systematically drilling at Tamarack for the feasibility study, starting in the northern areas where the mineralization is shallow, a couple hundred meters down, and then progressively marching to the south. And in this winter, we got to the 138 zone, which is the southernmost area of the resource, to get it from inferred to indicated. And the drilling had completed for one of the rigs. And so we had a little bit of kind of spare time with that rig. We've always wanted to get geophysics down some of these holes. That's one of the things that when Talon took over as the operator, we have in-house geophysics, we have in-house drilling, we have our own tooling now for borehole EM tooling. So the first thing we did is we ran our geophysics probes, EM probes, down existing boreholes to get like higher density of data collection. And that's actually what led to the CJ West discovery a couple years ago. So we've had good success doing that, but some of these holes have blocked in the 138 zone, and 250 in particular was one of those. And the rig was actually on that pad. So we said, it'd be great if we can open up that hole to run our own geophysics and get a picture of what's going on down there. And we knew that we were going to want to probably extend that hole. The hole was initially drilled in, I think it was 2012, down to about 650 meters. But we were seeing a little bit of very subtle EM response in the bottom of the hole, which is why we were interested in rerunning it, reserving it with our newer equipment. So we just tagged it on the end, and yeah, 50 meters into drilling the extension of that hole to essentially clear it up. That's when we hit the 8 meters of massive sulfide. We were at PDAC when we did that. It was Brian Bangert, my geophysicist, and I were literally in a pub at PDAC when we were watching the photos come in on Imago. So kind of real time, box after box. And we would like hunker into a corner and pull up our computer and the model and like, where is this? It was a total surprise because it's deeper than everything else. It was a really, really memorable experience. And then we pushed that quite a bit deeper. We pushed that hole about 1 kilometer in order to set us up for a really nice borehole AM survey. And we took our time with that survey. And that generated a couple of interesting plates. One of those we followed up on, and we ended up hitting the massive sulphides in hole 563. The fun story about that one is Henri and I were on our way to the Pentagon that day, and the first couple of boxes came in at mixed massive sulphides. So again, another. It seems like I should travel more often because every time I travel somewhere, we hit interesting mineralization. But that hole, that was probably the most exciting hole that I've ever seen in terms of how it happened, because everybody on the project, all the geos were at the rig the entire day. Every box that came in, Henri and I were in DC at the time, and we'd be getting updates every 90 minutes of another picture of a box full of massive sulfide, and it was super exciting. It finally ended that night. We were able to get a good night's sleep, and then woke up in the morning. We popped back into the massive sulfides and started that process all over again. So it was about 2 days of just one of the most enjoyable experiences that I've had.
That's a lot of fun. So knowing drilling, if you're getting a new box of core every 90 minutes, that's pretty impressive. That's like you're able to drill very quickly there at Tamarack.
Yeah, well, this is one of the big functions of having an in-house drilling team is these guys. Some of these guys have been on the project for a long time when they were with a contracting company, but because we started our own in-house drilling, we have really good integration between the drilling and the geophysics. And so some of the issues that you might have, anyone who's run an exploration program knows of sometimes there's communication issues or there's different goals. But everyone, all the employees at Talon are shareholders. So even the drillers, everyone's on the same team. And so we're all rowing in the same direction. So when we took the drilling in-house, we saw about a 22% production increase. We also drilled a record number of meters at Tamarack. It was 33,000 meters. My favorite stat, the first year that we took drilling in-house, we drilled about 357 meters of massive sulfide on the project. The entire life of the project had only drilled 326 over the 15 years or whatever. So in 1 year, with in-house drilling guided by in-house geophysics, we crushed that record. And the key to this is we can run the geophysics while we're just after we finish the hole. They'll pull back a little bit where we're on the geophysics. We then head back to the core shed. We process that data, and before the drillers even have the rods completely out of the hole, we know where that target is. So we can act very quickly. There's no delay of getting it modeled. There's no sending it to a third party. We do it all in-house, and within hours we have the next target, and we can target the next target with that hole. The old way of doing this is you have to send it out for, someone else to take a look. Typically you do it at the end of the season, and then you lose your window to follow up on targets until the next year. And that's, I think, why exploration often takes quite a bit of time, is you're always waiting for the interpretation, whereas we can do it same day.
So that's very interesting, because I think that's a really important point that a lot of people in the junior mining industry, especially investors, don't really understand. The reason why things take so long is because everything is being done by third-party contractors. Obviously, you need to send the core to the assay lab, and that has to be a third-party contractor. But aside from that, you can do the drilling, the geophysics, you can do all the core logging by your own staff. Like, that's possible, and that's available to all other companies as well. Why don't more companies have this kind of setup that Talon has?
I think it takes a pretty defined vision, first of all, and it's a lot of work to do it. But the benefit is once you do that work, it just runs by itself. You mentioned the assays, and that's one that I would actually beg to differ a little bit. I think there's a creative solution around that, where this is something that Henri, I was sitting in my deer stand and we were texting, and Henri said, how can we get a sense of not only if the hole was good or bad, but quantify how good a drill hole was before we get the assays. This was in COVID. Assays were taking forever in COVID. It was, it could be 6 months sometimes for assays. And so we actually built an algorithm based on the metal tenors, the nickel tenors of the different rock types we have. And it's based on the geologist looking at percentage of sulphides. So not the, we don't have to go into what kind of sulphides. That's all taken into account. So all the geo has to do is estimate the percentage of sulphides. Acquire then says, based on that percentage, here's what the grade should be. We then send that to our models, and they model up in a block model. It shows up as ore. It goes to the engineers who can build, the decline, the stopes, and then it goes to the finance people who can see what the NPV impact is of this new hit. All of that can be done, within 2 weeks, and if we push really, really hard, within about a day or two, if everybody is lined up. The benefit of that is from the drilling, and this was really helpful when we were delineating CGO East and West. We knew not only was it good, but we could quantify how good it was. And then we would get the assays back and they would just overwrite. And then you'd run it, make sure everything was good. The question we always get is, how good are your estimates? And this is the beautiful thing with nickel, is you can actually get pretty good. So we championed this mineralization estimate champion board, and I'll send you a photo of this. But it's basically a plaque. All the geos get together. We take guesses as to what we think the assays are going to run. Whoever got closest is enshrined on the board as the winner. The first one was 21.7 meter intercept of massive sulfide. The estimate was 6.72% nickel, and the assay was 6.75. So 200 ppm off from visual. And you don't have to be 30 years experience to do this. We've had one lady, it was her 3rd day of work as a nickel geologist, had no nickel experience before, and she got on the board. So I think if you think outside the box a little bit, I think you can get creative and kind of shortcut some of those things that otherwise take weeks or months to get answers to.
I mean, this is very, refreshing for me to hear you guys talk about the Talon culture, the processes, the way that you do things at Tamarack. I think this is a great example for the industry. Going back to Henri, I want to go back to Brian, of course, later and talk more about this new massive sulfide area. But going back to Henri, so you just raised $30 million of the American dollars that you can actually spend in your project area. $30 million. The financing sort of came together very quickly. There seems to be some notable participants in this financing. What can you tell us about how the financing came together and who participated?
Yeah, I think it's obviously pretty well captured in the press releases. We did do a significant upsizing, and it happened within days. I mean, it didn't take a long time. And I think a little bit related to what Brian talked about, that drill hole. I wouldn't say totally surprising, but this upsizing to me was quite interesting, and to some extent surprising in an environment that still tells me that China's decided to control the nickel markets, and I listen to these stories a lot. So happened within days. In terms of people coming in, I think notably from an Ivanhoe perspective, we've put that in the press release. I think if somebody does know this industry and somebody that we need to learn from a lot, as Talon and Tamarack, that'd be Robert. So I think that's a big step for us. It's not just the quantum, but the fact that I think that gives a lot of validation about where we think this project could go, and the different types of technologies we can deploy in the future on this project. And then we have people that's been with us for a long time. And I think they do appreciate the fact that, yes, we have a Lassonde curve. It's all predictable. It's really hard to say that you're going to be that different. I think the focus is on what's the most effective way of getting through that Lassonde curve. And I think with the cash that we have for the door, which again, didn't expect that level of interest, but it's a lot of validation. And in terms of the usage of the proceeds, I think you and I spoke about this. The nice thing about us is we have an exploration services division. We decided that you asked a question about why do other people not do it. I can tell you, but they don't do it. And I think there's a lot of benefit that companies that have, they have greenfields operations that they need to expand, or brownfields that they have to expand, that's coming to an end, or they're looking at a pretty big district and they need to dial that in and not spend, like Brian says, get to the end of the season, go back the next season. So we have stood up that as its own business, and we're looking to receive the cash flows coming out of that business to fund feasibility study, fund the permitting process, which means the cash that came in, some of that proceeds would help us to speed things up. But I would say a lot of that is just, hey, do we have the ovoid? Is that what are we actually dealing with? If you have something of this nature, when you see these kinds of grades over these kinds of intervals, and if you kind of look at what we've seen in the past and you combine that with the MT, and Brian can talk you through that a little bit more, it really does mean that you can solve a lot of the North American supply issues from this project. And I can go into more detail if you wanted to, but we are in a crisis when it comes to nickel. And that crisis needs to be solved. And I think we have the solution. So that money is not just enabling Talon. That money, in my opinion, enables the US and the Canadian, let's call it the North American nickel supply chain, that's going to produce these super alloys, that's going to go into a host of applications that without, and it's about 50,000 tons per annum, just on the US end of it, that goes into super alloys. Without this nickel, honestly, I don't know what we do.
Yeah, it's true. We have one nickel mine, or one primary one, and it's running out of ore in, I guess, a few years, 3 or 4 years from now. Brian did mention a trip to the Pentagon, so I want to ask you what your conversations are with the Pentagon and what kind of feedback are you getting in terms of the raw materials, supply chain, and how Tamarack ties into that for the DoD?
No, that's a really good question. Brian, you want to talk a bit about the DoD grant and the mission behind that in terms of the acceleration of nickel in the nickel belt?
Yeah. So a couple years ago, we applied for and received a $20.6 million grant with the Department of Defense for the acceleration of identifying more nickel in America. So that's really across Michigan and Minnesota, where we have tenure. That's what kicked off, our Michigan project, essentially. And then we hit the Boulderdash intercept on hole 1, which was, another really good discovery of about 100 meters of circa 2% copper equivalent, starting at 9 meters down. So we drilled a couple more holes there, and now that's where the rigs are right now, drilling that out to see, is there size. Notably, it's about 8 miles from the Eagle mine. We think it's probably in the same dike, the exact same system, so just a continuation. And on our 8th hole there, we saw massive sulphides, which was the first massive sulphide hit that we had. So from a Department of Defense standpoint, the whole premise is, let's find more nickel in America. We're pretty sure that the U.S. has a pretty decent endowment of nickel in the Mid-Continent Rift. It's just that a lot of that land has been private for 100 years. So there hasn't been a lot of nickel exploration. And then the second part of that is the acceleration part. So instead of taking the standard industry approach of, hit it for a year, come back, analyze everything, and take years to get it done, we take this advanced exploration system, which we call the AES, which is Talon's operating model, and we throw everything we have at it. And I really subscribe to the fail fast approach of hit it hard, make a decision, and if it's okay for things to fall off, it's actually better, I think, if some things fall off, because we have so many targets in the pipeline in Michigan and at Tamarack, of course.
Fail fast. Okay, I want to pick your brain on that because I think it's an interesting topic, and you have a lot of expertise on this, I'm sure, from your time in the industry. So for a junior with a new target area, let's say they've done all the IP or whatever, the mag, the gravity surveys that they need to do. They've done all the surface work. They've worked up their targets. Would you encourage a junior to go big with big step outs straight away and just, if you miss, it's no big deal? Or I know some companies really focus on like their highest probability target and they just hone in on that and stay in that area so they don't miss, or they don't, you know, drill a bunch of, you know, zero holes.
I think everything has to honor the geophysics or the geology. But, you know, with borehole EM, I think borehole EM is probably the best example of this. If you take a big step out and you're swinging from grand slams with every drill hole, you're not honoring the geophysics and you're not being guided by the geophysics. So if you know what your limits are, so for us, we say about 30 meters is as far as we can see, and we're essentially blind after that. So it doesn't make any sense to take a 60-meter step out if you're just drilling into the void. That's why, like with the CGO West discovery, we didn't think there was a lot of room, but we saw a plate. It was only 25 meters away, and we said, you know what, let's drill that plate. And that's where our massive sulphides went from 1 meter to 14 meters thick. And it was a change in geometry that allowed for there to be a fair bit of volume. The thing that I like about doing smaller step outs like this and honoring the geophysics is it opens you up to be pleasantly surprised. Sometimes things change, and you may have assumptions like we did that there wasn't enough space in the CGO West. Therefore, you know, let's not drill the hole. But by relying on the geophysics, you can get surprised that, look, there is space because, oh, something happened there that you haven't seen. It's totally different, and it allows for the creation of a deposit.
Okay, so back to the new massive sulphide zone at Tamarack. So the interpretation, and these are my words, just reading your news, essentially, is there's a waterfall there, and that's a term that's used. It's not an actual waterfall, but it looks like one. And it's potentially formed a pool of massive sulphides in this new target zone. So the geophysics, what is it telling you about this new zone that you've drilled 2 holes into so far? And what is the potential target size of this area?
Okay, so the geophysics, you know, one of the unfortunate things about borehole EM is it doesn't tell you size. It tells you that there's something conductive. One of the problems is if you're inside of a conductive body, you can't see outside of it. So this is where having some holes that miss are really, really helpful because you can get outside and you can look backwards. You can get a pretty good idea of where that edge is. You can see where it starts, but you have no idea how thick it is. So that's where borehole EM has to tie in with, you know, a fair bit of drilling. You need both of them. The borehole EM guides the drilling, but you need the drilling to test the geophysics. So in terms of size, we couldn't even hazard a guess. What I like about it though is it clearly appears to be, you know, draining down. And when things drain, you have no idea how much sulphides have drained through that and how much is left to find at the bottom. It could be that what we're finding are, you know, some sulphides that are caught on a ledge as it continues to drain down. It could be, you know, who knows? We need to do more work. What we do know at Tamarack is the sulphides are always in country rock where the sediments have been partially melted. So you're in close proximity to an intrusion. It heats up the country rock, and those sediments turn a little plasticky, and this dense liquid, this massive sulphides, is able to kind of worm its way down. So as long as we stay in that area of melted sediments, that's the, you know, the area that we expect to find the sulphides. I've got a piece of core that's polished from the new zone. It is absolutely stunning. One of the interesting things around the massive sulphides is we're seeing what we think is hypogene mineralization. So for the first time at Tamarack, we see chalcocite veins radiating away. We see covellite, we see bornite. You know, we talked about this in one of the press releases that we're seeing these things. That's really unusual. And we're seeing it above and below the massive sulphides, which, you know, starts to make you wonder, is this part of a larger system? Is there something else that's going on? Because, I mean, I've been at Tamarack for 18 years. I've never seen chalcocite, bornite, or covellite anywhere in the entire deposit. But here, in both of those holes, we see it around. So right now, we have more questions than answers. But, you know, we're planning a drill program to hopefully test some of those questions and see how big we can make this. With grades like this, though, you don't need a huge amount of size.
Is there another comparable project that you can point us to that you know of in the world where you have a situation like this, where you have the massive sulphides at the bottom of a waterfall with, as you said, chalcocite and bornite and covellite in proximity to it?
Short answer is no. I don't know of one. There are, one of the really unique things about Tamarack, even though it's 1 billion years old, nothing has happened geologically since it was placed. So Tamarack is this kind of living laboratory of here's what an intrusion looks like. As it came in, it hasn't been chopped up. There's no faulting, and it really, I don't think it's been rotated at all. So it's just frozen in time. You know, a lot of the other projects have been moved around, especially when you get into the billions of years of age. In terms of analog, I mean, everyone says this, but I do truly believe if you want to see an analog, I think you have to go to Russia. Norilsk is one of the areas where, especially when you look at the Raptor Zone, that we have a lot of similarities texturally, taxitic gabbros, vesicles, rip-ups, massive sulphides, things like that. And I think we'll see a comparable size in the intrusion size as well. So they have a 100-year head start on us. We only have about 20 years of drilling, but I think we'll get there.
Okay. So speaking of drilling, what's next in the new massive sulphide zone past hole 63? Do you go back down hole 63 and do a wedge or a few, you know, wedges from there, or do you drill a complete new step out hole?
I'm a huge fan of directional drilling, especially when you get into these depths, 700 meters. It really pays for itself. So that's what we'll do, is go down an existing hole and start with small step outs. We have a lot of experience with directional drilling, and it's a really efficient way to test step outs, limiting the number of meters you have to drill. Speeds it up as well. So that's our preferred method. The only downside is, you know, once you pop out of a hole, you can't get back in the parent hole. So, you know, we need to make sure we get all of the geophysics collected ahead of time before we set that wedge and cement the bottom part of the hole, because you're never going to get back in.
Okay, that's good to know. That's very important to know. So, you know, investors always want to know, when are the next, you know, results going to come out? So basically, now that you have this extra 30 million to work with, what's next, and what do you think the timing will be of more assays from this new zone?
Well, I mean, what we're looking, so the rigs are drilling in Michigan right now, and that was always the plan. This hole came as a surprise, a very good surprise, but a surprise nonetheless. So, you know, we need to kind of retool ourselves, and that's why I'm actually meeting with my team on site this week. We're putting together kind of the plan, and then we intend to be drilling in July at Tamarack to drill some of these holes. Now, it's all dependent on contractor availability for directional drilling and things like that, but that's kind of the timeline is, I mean, I'm dying to drill this thing more than anybody else, so I want to get down there. In terms of assays, you know, they take the time they take, but, you know, I don't see any reason why we can't put out core photos in a press release like we did with both hole 250 and 563.
Okay, very good. All right, so back to Henri. Give us an update on, because you guys are in permitting, you've been doing permitting. where do you stand with the permitting process in Minnesota? And does this new discovery change anything, with regard to permitting?
No, it doesn't change anything for us, mostly because of the proximity within the land area from a permitting point of view. And none of it's been proven to any level of resource. So, excuse me, you don't want to get ahead of yourself. It's kind of point one. In terms of where we are, we began the process. It's actually an environmental review in Minnesota back in June of 2023. And we've been through three what they call environmental assessment worksheets that we send to the state, and they send back comments. And then, as I said, we go through this whole analysis of, hey, how can we improve? How can we do better? I call it the listening process. We onto the response to the third comments that we have received from the state. We actually just submitted that yesterday. And in terms of what happens next, that's a question for the state. And this, coming back to the regulatory governmental unit, I think that takes a bit of time to analyze in terms of what we send back. In terms of the regulatory process, the next step it's loosely called scoping. And what that means is, hey, we now have a project that we defined, and it's really, really important to follow what that means. It means that we have a project that we can study what the environmental impact is going to be. And that's why I absolutely love the Minnesota process, because instead of going into the project and that you may or may not have defined well, we spend almost now 24 months defining the project. And I think that's the key to success in any project is you need to define what it is you're going to do and stick to it until it's done. And that's the next phase of the process. That also does include from a regulatory point of view, and I think it's a really good process, is looking at alternatives. And this is quite interesting to us because we did embrace that in the EAW process, which I don't know that many people have done that before us. And we have studied hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of alternatives as a consequence of getting the comments through this process. So we're looking forward to going into what's called scoping. And scoping is what defines what you're going to, again, study in the environmental impact statement. And once that's done, you get adequacy or you don't get adequacy. So the next big exciting part for us and the amount of data that we collected to support this, and Brian can talk about that a little bit more, is I think the most comprehensive data package that's ever been collected in Minnesota from an environmental point of view and from a technical point of view. So the big day for us is going into scoping and in EIS after having spent around 24 months to really define very well what is the project design basis.
Okay. And then you're working on a feasibility study in tandem, and that's due out in the second half of this year. Can you tell us any more about the feasibility study?
That's super exciting. So people, I looked at the process in the handbook again. So you do feasibility, then you go into permitting. We switched it. We went into environmental review, and we do a feasibility study to support environmental review. And what I mean by that is if we get a comment and we do a study of something that's an alternative to what we've designed, that is all part of what used to be called PFS. It's just a whole bunch of trade-off studies. So if you can't take these rocks and have it being feasible, shouldn't be doing this job. So we don't have a question about technical feasibility. And I think that's an important distinction. What we need to know is what is the project going to look like from environmental review and permitting point of view. So we very far down into feasibility, but I can tell you again, we've done hundreds of these trade-off studies or alternatives during this process to support the environmental review process. So what you're going to see from environmental review process point of view and a feasibility study is linked 100%. And again, all of these studies have been done to support that process. So it's super exciting that we've been the beneficiary of going through this. The alternative to this is you do a feasibility study, which I think is quite actually not a good idea, and then go out and, like the textbook says, then you begin the permitting process, which I don't think that's a good way to go. So yeah, we're looking to get that done in tandem with what I just referred to as scoping. Because think about it, scoping says, I'm going to study what's going to be the environmental impact of this project. That's when you need to know that your feasibility study does back up what's called the proposed action on the project description that's going to be studied in the EIS. So it's all connected, 1,000% connected at Talon. Not typically people do it a little bit, I think, disjointed.
Yeah, typically they determine if the economics are viable, and it's all about the economics, and then they do the permitting. But that can go wrong because the permitting can then tell you you can't build it that way, you know. So it changes the economics then. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense, you know, Henry. Yeah. Going back to Brian, I have a curiosity here. If we go back to hole 63, there's a 20-meter, you know, interval that's 26.7 or so, you know, nickel equivalent, and then there's a 14.5-meter wide interval of 32%. So the grade is increasing at depth towards the end of hole 63. To my brain, that tells me you're getting into the sweet spot. Is that right or wrong interpretation?
You know, I think at this point your guess is as good as mine. The things that I took away from that drill hole is that when you look at the contacts, they're pretty flat. And, you know, this hole was a 87-degree hole. If this was a vertically dipping body, I would have expected, you know, sharper, steeper contacts. That's one of the things that started us really scratching our heads when we were drilling that first intercept. But yeah, the grades in that lower massive sulphide are even better. In fact, every single individual sample, 1.5 meter sample in that lower massive sulphide is better than anything we have at Tamarack, by a fair bit. You know, individual samples, I think the best was 19.4% nickel, just straight nickel, not equivalent. So yeah, it's really keen to find the continuation of that.
Yeah, I'm very keen to find the continuation of that too. 17% nickel and 16% copper, 16 grams per ton platinum, 9 grams gold. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I've never seen a drill hole like this in my life. So yes, I'm keen to find the continuation of that as well. You know, going back to Henry, I think a question some investors have, you have a JV with the second largest mining company in the world on Tamarack. They have 40%, you have 60%. That is, you know, Rio Tinto, for those who don't know. Do you talk with them? Did they give you any feedback on this drill hole? Yeah, I'm just interested to know about that.
Yeah, no. So presently we are at 51.49. We're going up to 60% by finishing this feasibility study, and that's a payment we make to Rio Tinto at that point, or Kennecott. I would say Rio has been the best partner. I mean, I give them all the credit. Brian is from Rio. We're standing on those, what do we call it, the shoulders of giants, and not just as a giant mining company, but the thought process that led to doing the impossible, which is opening up these areas, making these discoveries from absolutely nothing back in the day. In terms of communication, super good communication. You know, I'm really appreciative of the fact that they're able to, I can take my block models and send that into Rio Tinto and get really good comments. So I'm sure that my block models are compliant with the best of the best on the planet. Although it's 43-101 and it's done extra to me, I still have the second check that we get back from, as you said, the world's second largest mining company. They have the systems, they have the people, they have the smarts. So no, I really appreciate everything that we've been doing with Rio Tinto on this project. And you know, the conversations are, as you can imagine, extremely technical, because we're dealing with such an important project and all the questions that you've been asking. So that's super good to be able to have that ability to bounce off ideas and talk technical with a mining company, which you don't typically have in a project like this. If you junior exploration, sometimes you're just like an island. There's not that much you can bounce off anyone. anyone. We have that opportunity to have Rio step up and helping us through the process.
Does Talon Metals want to build this mine? Do you guys want to take this all the way?
We want to do nothing more. We committed to getting Tesla nickel, and what we want to do is get Tesla nickel. And Brian wants to stand in front of that, I don't know, 40 meters of, pure golden massive sulphides, and look at that face and go like, yeah, we've made this happen. This is. We took it from essentially inception with Rio, and then took over as the operator and took it through the mining process. And I'm actually, it's kind of funny. Sounds funny. I'm super concerned about super alloys and where the nickel is going to come from. Not the expert on what's happening in Canada, but those mines have been going for 120 years. And when you get that deep, it gets really, really complicated. And China has invested tens of billions in Indonesia to control every single product that you make in nickel, like all of the intermediates, so that they can control the price. And I get why they do this, but we have to have a reasonable response, and digging deeper is challenging. Having something like what Brian says, we're seeing at least the indications that we have something like what you have in Russia. Now we have this discovery. We got to get it done. And I think that's why also we have all the support from the federal government. This is way beyond, hey, this is a mining project. This is really a crisis in how we're going to make all the good stuff that you make with super alloys. I mean, USGS put out a detailed report back in 2022. It takes about 50 to 60,000 tons annually of imported nickel that all comes out of the supply chain that comes through the Canadian system. And it has to be pure nickel to make these super alloys. So yes, batteries are important. We have to deal with Tesla, but it goes way beyond batteries into super alloys. That I really think, yes, we want to get this. We want to stick to what we said we're going to do it until it's done, and make the nickel that's needed for the supply chain.
Fighter jets and spaceships need super alloys. And if the viewer wants to dig down a rabbit hole, start to learn about super alloys and all the super obscure metals with high melting points that go into super alloys, and how the US has none of the processing capacity for all those metals. So yeah, we are in a crisis. I completely agree, Henri. Going back to Brian, let me ask you one more question about the geophysics. So slide 25 in the Talon presentation, this is a slide you've had for a year or more, and I think some people are a little puzzled by it. So there's a big anomaly, like 1,500 meters deep. You call it the Raptor Zone plane. And it's unclear to me what this anomaly represents. Have you drilled it? Do you plan to drill it? Explain slide 25 to us.
Yeah, well, I don't think an MT anomaly has ever been really all that clear to anyone. MT by default is a bit nebulous. It is an MT anomaly. It resides directly underneath the Tamarack deposit. It's discrete, so we see it over 2, maybe 3 lines. And we did drill it. So we drilled a hole. We put this out in, I think, of the press release at the start of the year. The interesting thing is when you take that Raptor Zone plane, which is the plane that links up all the massive sulphides that we've been finding in the Raptor Zone, it goes about 4 kilometers. Right where that projects underneath the MT anomaly is where we hit some mineralization. And the mineralization that we hit there, it's a few boxes full, so maybe 10 meters. It has massive sulfide chunks that are about 4 or 5 centimeters. It also has some semi-massive sulfide looking material. And that to me was really key because we've only seen the SMSU unit, the semi-massive sulfide unit, in the Tamarack deposit. So it just now shows us that we're seeing mineralization deep underneath Tamarack. We're seeing mineralization that has the same hallmarks of what Tamarack itself has. And at the time of drilling that, we thought, again, that everything was coming up from the south. which has always kind of been the model. But this empty anomaly and then the deep drilling has made us start to question that okay, maybe some of the mineralization came up from the south, and then gets recycled and upgraded in tenors. And you can see that from CGO East all the way down to the massive sulphide. The tenors keep bumping up. So that makes sense. But it made us start to think, if we have a vertical connector underneath Tamarack and we're seeing class of mineralization that look a lot like Tamarack, do we have more of that kind of vertical connector? And then we drilled this new deep zone in the 138 area, which also looks very vertical. So that was kind of the first iteration of thinking maybe there's more to go onto the story. That yes, the mineralization in the FGO comes up from the south, but we think the CGO might actually be coming up vertically now, which opens up a whole new area for exploration. Clearly, like the MT anomaly is deep, so it's not going to be our focus right now. But I think we can, with that new model in mind, we can apply that model to the 563 area and start chasing it down. Depth has now opened up as a real exploration avenue.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, that's exciting. I'm starting to picture the scale potential here. This could be very vast, but yeah, that is deep. Look, this has been a fantastic conversation, guys. I really appreciate it. I want to give both of you the final word. Maybe there's something I didn't ask. There's something more you want to say. I'll give you the floor here for the final few minutes. What did you say?
I think he was throwing it over to me. No, I think you really covered it. I mean, I guess the only thing that I would say is, the integration of geophysics, geology, drilling into one cohesive, exploration machine is really exciting, and it's fun seeing how you can get stuff done, how you can generate targets and test them quickly, and really progress a fail-fast approach that works really well if you have quite a quiver of targets in your arrows in your quiver to test. So I'm really excited for Michigan. I'm really excited for Tamarack. I think the next year will be really exciting for Talon.
Let me ask one more question to Henri. I know there's a few catalysts lined up for the second half of the year. What can you tell us about the timing of the news flow for Talon in the second half of 2025?
Good question. So as Brian says, we have rigs running in Michigan all the time. So I think we should expect results from that project. And the prospects are really, really, really good. As Brian said, we're busy with the planning sessions this week. I think we can expect much more news coming out of Tamarack, specifically on the site that Brian's talking about with this new discovery. But I think the really exciting part, for me at least, is the connection between this feasibility study and going to the scoping period with the RGU, the Regulatory Governmental Unit. As Brian said, the fascinating thing about us is we actually do integration, and not only geophysics and geology, but we integrate engineering and design with environmental review and permitting. And the next phase of this is, this thing called EPCM and EPC, and it's a nasty habit of infrastructure projects, not just mining, that's over budget, over time, and creating a lot of issues. And we see a lot of upside on that side of the equation through a whole bunch of integration processes that we are working on with partners to again change the way that things are done from a delivery aspect. So you got the same theme in exploration as what you have in permitting and feasibility. The next exciting phase is how do we change the EPC and EPCM model to get our projects on time and on budget. So I think quite a bit of news flow from that in the future could be expected as well.
All right, very good. A extremely exciting second half of 2025 is ahead for Talon Metals, well funded with plenty of runway to generate impactful news flow. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert.
Appreciate the opportunity. Bye-bye.